for this. I appreciate your time today. I just wanted to introduce Model Risk Managers International Association to those who didn't know us before. Um, we have been in existence almost 8 years now, focusing on issues around model risk management. And we just had our annual event back at the end of February, and we thought that would be it for this year. And then SR 26.2 came out, and we decided, well, we should get people together to talk about it. So the benefit of being a small organization is being adaptable, and I definitely want to thank our board members who are leading the different sessions today. They jumped in and did a lot in a short amount of time, bringing together some great panels here to speak on this topic. It's quite interesting, and I hope you can stay with us throughout the day for our half-day event, but it will also be recorded. So anything you miss, feel free to come back later. And of course, those recordings go on our website, mrmia.org, and we welcome you to join MRMIA to help fund activities like this. We are nonprofit and all volunteer. No one takes a salary here. We all just chip in to make things happen. So thank you for joining. That's enough from me. I'm going to turn it over to Tom Dolan. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I know I'm not going to say good morning. I know we're coming in from all different areas globally. But the purpose of our discussion this morning relates obviously to the SR 26.2. This is a long-awaited refresh that we were expecting. The reactions that we have seen across the industry have been largely mixed. At some levels, they've been largely just been muted. Not a lot expected change as a result of this. Whereas there has been other sentiment that is a bit more ominous in nature, which is something that we wanted to address head on ourselves. Most affected would otherwise be the banks as it relates to eligibility, the size, the $10 to $30 billion banks. What does it really mean? So I'm joined today with my good friends and colleagues. I have Bree Pentecost from Bank of Hawaii, and we have Jill Murphy from Mechanics Bank out in California. So thank you also for joining this morning. What we wanted to try to do this morning in our limited time is really try to address these three big sentiments that we have seen out there that we'd like to just head on address. We believe these to be essentially erroneous conclusions that have been made about the 26.2. And it seems as though there's good reason why a person can come to some of the wrong conclusions on this. The language in 26.2 is highly nuanced. You cannot just rush through the guide and say, what does this mean? You have to take some time and look through it carefully. So in our approach today, there's really two things. Really just, again, to talk about why we are refuting some of these three themes that we see that came up a few times. And then the second thing is if we can offer some recommendations that you may consider in your own program. Okay, so Tyler, if you can go on to the next page here. I can't see your pages, and I'll just assume you made the change. So the first point that came up pretty regularly was the 26.2 provides regulatory relief, that somehow it's been diluted or downgraded. And our first point that we'd like to bring attention to is the key fundamentals of 11.7 remain intact through 26.2. The DNA of model risk remains intact. What we see here is that the pillars that we saw in 11.7, which includes the model development, implementation, validation, model monitoring, governance policies, that all remains. There's no removal of any of those. Now, there is some latitude given to the degree that certain expectations should be set on these, specifically as it relates to documentation of vendor models. But again, the key is that the fundamentals remain intact. And in fact, they continue to move on to the importance of models, the advancements of technology. Certainly AI since 11.7 has exponentially grown. The key challenge of the 11.7 was to the degree that a risk-based approach could be adopted was really based on size and complexity. Now, the size and complexity may have caused some challenges for the smaller banks because it's difficult to make a determination what exactly does that mean. So what we see here in 26.2 is some positive refinements. And what that means is they're starting to introduce some key concepts that will help what was otherwise the size and complexity. How do you adjust your sound model risk in your bank to still maintain and meet with compliance of the guidance? So what they're introducing is the concepts of inherent model risk and model materiality. That's something that we did not see in 11.7. What is inherent model risk? How do you derive that? Because a key point that we see in 26.2 is they're expressing that if you have a significant exposure to model risk, that's where the expectation is that you should have a sound model risk approach. Okay, so they're moving over to more of a principles-based approach as opposed to prescriptive. So essentially, they're saying, no, don't do checklists. They're giving a little bit more clarity in terms of model definitions. They're allowing for a little bit more latitude in terms of validation frequency, which should be driven off of these new concepts that they're offering. And what this essentially does is for banks that have a sound model risk program today, it's really codifying those practices. So the burden of proof is really shifting over to the banks themselves, which actually you can impute this as being, this is actually a testament to the maturity of the model risk programs, particularly as it relates to the mid-sized banks. The key recommendations that we wanted to provide is number one is in the 26.2, there is this language that I just mentioned, inherent model risk, model materiality. You may wish to incorporate that into your policies and your frameworks. It will demonstrate a greater linkage that you're adhering to this new 26.2. The next key recommendation we wanted to offer is to conduct an inherent model risk assessment for the bank. So in your own bank, how do you make a determination what is the level of inherent model risk in the bank that would determine what's the qualification, what's the criteria of which you need to adopt soundness in your model risk. And then the third item that we would recommend is to conduct the individual model materiality. Again, a new concept that we're moving over from what would have otherwise been complexity impact, and now we're shifting more towards purpose and exposures. Okay, moving on to next page here. All right, so we had key question is applicability. So for those banks that are in that 10 to 30 billion dollars, how do you develop a inherent model risk assessment? This can help drive the scope of your risk-based approach, and it helps answer the question, do you have significant model exposure in the bank? So again, if this is not specified within the guidance itself, this is I think we could refer to this as a back of the envelope approach that you can adopt in some way, shape, form, or another to say, yes, you're part of that big boy club. You need to have a fully fleshed out program. So if you consider there are potentially 5 different aspects that can help drive your inherent risk, size of the organization, how complex is the business? Is it just retail only? Does it include commercial, specialty products? Where is your regional activity? Is it single state, multiple states, a region? Do you have 3 models? Do you have 20 models? And the final one is an efficiency ratio. If you have much lower efficiency ratios, it might suggest that you are pretty tight with the money. So on the bottom left here, you can see a little schema. If we utilize those different drivers, we can assign some points. Again, this is for your level of adoption. If you want to drop off one of these or add another one, that's fine. The point is to try to have some type of schema, and then just map this to these different factors, and then you can score this up and say, well, if I have, and I put this in the light green here. Say, for example, there's a bank that's a $20 billion bank, and it's both in commercial and retail. It includes a census region, maybe 20 models, and it has a very low efficiency ratio. So assign points to high, medium, and low, and just add this up. Really, really simple, straightforward. It's very easy for certainly your senior management or regulators to say, oh, they have a higher level of risk. Again, I have a legend over on the right-hand side. So if your points came to above 50, at that point, the determination is we are going to have a fully fleshed out model risk management, standards, procedures, evidence. It shows what your needs are and your capability build out. Again, the key is to be consistent on this. Okay. On my last page here, I want to show is to demonstrate how you use these concepts to make a sound model risk decisioning. So in this case here, we're introducing the concept of model materiality to set a validation frequency. So we should be risk rating your individual models. Are these high risk models? Are these low risk models? So that this can help you drive your frequency, the treatment. So not all tier ones should necessarily get the same treatment. Maybe they should be a little bit different. And likewise is how do you manage model risk overall? So in this case here, we have this new concept of purpose and exposure. Purpose is the nature of the use of these models, and exposure being what is the business importance to these. And likewise, you have complexity over on the other side. Again, a similar approach as I just described in inherent. You can then create a schema such that you have the complexity being more and more sophisticated models. The purpose is more or less in terms of, is it regulatory, is it financial types of models, or is it just assistant based? And then finally, is the exposure of this models, is it an enterprise or is it an individual model? If you use that approach, again, same thing on the bottom, you can just simply map each one. I'll just go through one single example. You may have a CECL model. The complexity may be very high. It uses many regression models. It uses more of a financial risk model, and your exposure is at the enterprise level. So your materiality is, you can just take a simple average of that, again, to get some discrimination across all of your different models. Your months of validation would be 12 months. And if you have a control impact, you may introduce a control impact. In this case, we're introducing the validations. So if you had a validation for that model that you completed, and it was in this case here, it was a pass with high conditions, essentially a C minus. We're not giving it any additional dispensation in the timing of this. Conversely, if you have a BSA model, same thing, same complexity, same purpose, same exposure, you may have the same materiality. However, because that model received a better validation outcome, last time it was done, we're going to push that frequency out a little bit more. Again, the idea is to use model materiality to help set your frequency, your treatment, and encourage good behavior. Good behavior. In this case, this example is if you get a good outcome because you're managing that model well, it's well developed, you get a benefit, and the benefit is we're extending your timeline. So, with that, I'm going to open this up to questions. I think, Jill, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? We're
Yeah.
still.
Yes,
Oh,
I do. Sorry, I was on mute.
okay.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Jill.
Yeah, I did see a question from the audience, but if there's time, I do have a question for you, Tom.
Please.
Okay, great. So given your perception that the comments about the perception that SR 26.2 eases up on regulation, do you think that institutions may now face greater scrutiny in how they justify governance tailoring decisions, particularly below the $30 billion threshold?
Yeah. So it's not safe to presume exactly what the regulators will do, but I think it's fair to expect that the change with this regulation is actually very sensible. And the reason why I think this is sensible is because it's an allocation question. It's a time, it's an expertise allocation from our examiners, such that they will most likely want to focus their time, energy, and efforts on those that present the systemic risk to the economy. So the focus will continue to be on the 50 billion and above. That's where the intensity of their time will be. The next intensity that I think is reasonable is for those banks that are at that 8, 9, 10 billion that got away with doing any type of risk management from the 11.7 threshold that was set. And some of them have higher levels of risk. They may be in more specialty products. They could be in crypto. So they could have more exotic product. They could have more specialty lending. That's probably the second place. The third place, I believe, they'll continue to look at because they're certainly not walking away from the 10 to 30, but the intensity of this, it will be less in terms of I think you're not going to see as much of a horizontal review on the 10 to 30. The focus will be on the risk management because and the soundness of the bank as a whole. And if there's any problems, all roads eventually lead back to model risk management, because if there's a problem with liquidity or reserves, the question will ultimately be asked, who looked at this? So we don't get a get out of jail free card, but I think that's probably the rank order in terms of focus. So thanks, Jill.
Yeah, thank you.
With that, I think I'm going to hand this over to Bree. So Bree.
Thanks, Tom. So we can move on to the next set of the slides. And so our next topic is related to the concept of SR 26.2 simply replacing SR 11.7. And I mean, technically speaking, this is true, right? The introduction to SR 26.2 literally says that it supersedes and replaces SR 11.7. And so on its face, this is an accurate claim. But I think the problem is more so in how people are interpreting supersedes and replaces. I think some can hear that and think this means a clean slate. The old framework is dead, time to tear everything down and rebuild. Others might hear it and think there's a kind of simple swap. Okay, same exact program, just switch the citation to update it, and then we're good and can move on. And candidly, I probably am guilty of both of these in the span of like 30 minutes when this first came out. I'd previously heard rumblings that additional guidance or kind of communication from the regulators might be coming. But when I got the email that SR 11.7 was being formally superseded, my first reaction, I think, was panic. I just finished revamping our program, and now you're telling me I need to go back, redo everything for a whole new set of guidance. Then I actually sat down and read it. And I probably overcorrected the other way too far, where I was like, oh, you know what? This actually sounds pretty familiar. Maybe I don't need to do anything at all. But like Tom said, it's kind of more nuanced than that. What actually happened is it's not a replacement or just a relabeling. It's a continuation or an evolution from kind of SR 11.7. All that DNA is still intact with the core disciplines. Um, and so the overcorrection on the left-hand side here is wrong. You don't want to throw away 15 years of practice and completely scrap your existing policies to rebuild from scratch. There's no need to kind of revamp the governance committee structure when the foundational concepts there are still there. And certainly I would not recommend commissioning new validations across the board because that sounds annoying and expensive and unnecessary when the core disciplines, kind of independent challenge, conceptual soundness, process verification, ongoing, all of that is still there, preserved in the new guidance. But on the other hand, the underreaction on the right-hand side, I think, is underselling it. Just because a lot of the DNA is carried forward doesn't mean that nothing changed. And so I think it would be oversimplifying this situation to just do a find and replace in your policy documents for, SR 11.7 to SR 26.2. That's really missing the kind of fundamentally different operating model. And then we're missing out on some opportunities to kind of revisit some of the elements like the tiering structure, the validation timing. And then just because it formally carves out generative AI and non-model tools, I mean, those are still risky, so we shouldn't just completely disregard those. And so kind of digging into the general concept of what's the same and what's different. I'm sure everyone has seen their fair share of recaps on what's the same and what's not, on LinkedIn. Thank you to everyone who posts those because I have no problem stealing from everyone and kind of taking their interpretations. But on the left, I've kind of tried to highlight some of the foundation that stayed. We've all been living these concepts for the last 15 years, so I'm not going to walk through each one, but I did want to lay them out to really illustrate what I mean when I say that the DNA remains from SR 11.7. But focusing more on the right side with what actually changed, first should probably clarify that the rescission was broader than just SR 11.7. So it's not just a one-to-one swap. It also rescinded SR 21.8 on the BSA AML models, the OCC handbook, the legacy bulletin. Those are all technically rescinded as well. And so SR 26.2 is now the only guidance from the regulators, at least as far as I'm aware. And then the next few items in this right column really get at the crux of the matter and I think tell you the same thing. There's a formal materiality construct now, and Tom kind of walked us through what that scoring can look like. The model definition has more flexibility, the validation timing has more flexibility. And what all that really adds up to me, is that, figure out where the risk actually is and put your resources there. And I think that's where the opportunity is with this new guidance. For years, a lot of us have felt maybe a little constrained by how prescriptive SR 11.7 was, or at least how prescriptively it was interpreted. Um, you kind of know instinctually, not every model needs the same treatment, but the guidance didn't necessarily give a lot of room to act on that. But now, now it does. If you have a tool sitting in a gray area about whether it technically qualifies as a model, but doesn't actually pose any meaningful risk to the bank, stop stressing about what to call it. I see that there was a question in the chat about how to define a model or model versus calculator. And I prefer to think of it not about the technical definition of these things, but rather asking the question, does this warrant model risk management oversight and at what level? And kind of along those lines, if you've been validating a low materiality model every year because that's what you thought SR 11.7 required, I think now you can redirect those resources to your CECL model or your BSA model, where the risk actually lives. And so I think this is a chance to build a program that makes sense, maybe something you've always wanted to do, but didn't feel that you had the license to do so. Um, I've heard David Palmer reiterate these kinds of points for years at conferences like these. And I think SR 26.2 really seems to echo a lot of what he's been saying. I think SR 11.7 was supposed to be principles based in the first place, and the new guidance just better reflects that and gives a permission structure for what good programs we're already trying to do in terms of treating things differently. One thing I'd flag separately again is those carve outs and just kind of a caution on, just because the regulators are saying they're carved out of this particular guidance, I don't think it's them saying you don't need to worry about it. It just means, these still carry risk. And the absence of a prescribed framework doesn't remove the obligation to govern them. So just on the last slide, if we can skip ahead, overall, I think the best way to react to the new guidance is through targeted recalibration. So I've listed some examples of what that can look like in practice, and you might notice these map directly to some of the changes that we've already been talking about. But again, you can re-tier your model inventory using that materiality construct. Tom's approach gives an example of how this works to really get a more accurate and complete sense of the risk posed by each individual model. I think a lot of us already considered a lot of these factors, but now's a good time to revisit your approach and see if it's worth rejiggering at all, or maybe even adding in a lower materiality tier. In terms of validation frequency, we just talked, we don't need to validate everything annually, but you should be making a deliberate decision. What does the risk profile of this model actually justify? We want to match the investment to the risk that's there. Again, revisiting that model definition. And I'd encourage people to move past the binary model, non-model. Again, it's thinking about, does this warrant model risk management oversight, which is a slightly different question that to me is a bit easier to answer. And so when you frame it that way, maybe some things come out of your inventory, maybe some things that aren't technically models, with a statistical foundation now might deserve more attention than they're currently getting. We really just want to be designing for proportionate oversight. And then fill in those governance gaps on Gen AI and non-model tools just because they're carved out of this particular guidance. And then the one thing that kind of ties everything together is documenting every judgment call. This new guidance gives a lot more flexibility to do what makes sense and what is appropriate for the risk. But that also means there actually has to be some rationale for what you're doing, what's in scope and what isn't, what level of review that gets. All of that still needs to be defensible. But overall, I think of SR 26.2 as an opportunity, not an obligation. If your program was strong before, it's probably still just fine under the new guidance, honestly. But I think this is a chance to be more thoughtful about how we apply the principles. I've heard for years that model risk is not supposed to be a check the box exercise, but sometimes maybe that's how it could feel, particularly for the lowest risk models. But now we can focus less on what we feel we have to do and more what we think we should do in terms of adding value and targeting our resources more efficiently and effectively. So that's all my prepared remarks. I know we've taken up 30 minutes, so happy to answer questions or pass it along to Jill to kind of wrap us up.
Hey, Bree,
Mhm.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Absent, of course, in the 26.2 is any discussion, guidance on AI, and we know that's expected to come out hopefully later this year, because it has more broad-based impacts, not just model risk. So for those of us in our programs, we have AI. It's limited to tools, and some may actually have AI models in their inventory today. Do you have any comments or thoughts on treatment, or should we wait, or should we just continue to do as what we've been doing today anyways? Do you have any thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think waiting to have prescriptive guidance would be, in terms of either you're taking on too much risk by just saying it's a free for all, we can implement any tool with AI that we want, and, there's no oversight, so who cares? We can go for it. That I think would be uh, an inappropriate reaction. But so would, nope, I'm not comfortable doing anything until the regulators tell us exactly what to do. So we're just not going to use any AI at all. I think there it is important to keep moving forward in adopting those technologies, but doing so in a controlled manner. And it's well beyond just model risk, right? AI is just going to be such a multidisciplinary approach. And so if you don't already have kind of an AI working group or center of excellence or some cross-functional group that is helping make decisions about which AI to adopt, what controls are necessary, how to do it, what level of review is necessary. I would encourage people to establish that group and talk to people in compliance, in InfoSec, in legal, in all of these things to make sure that all those perspectives are taken into consideration and have some sort of framework to evaluate risk and have an approval workflow to make sure these necessary stakeholders are involved. And then again, do what makes sense for the risk. And hopefully in the future, when the regulators eventually come out with some guidance or leading and lagging practices, you're already most of the way there and can just recalibrate it the same way that we're recalibrating our model risk stuff now.
Thank you, Bree. As I hand this off to Jill, I want to reemphasize one kind of key point that I think you've been bringing up all along here, which is if you have a strong model risk program today, if anyone does a material change to that, that could be a red flag. If it's sound today, keep it sound. Don't be doing back hurdles. With that, I'm going to pass this over to Jill. Jill, if you could take us through the end here, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thanks, Tom. So Tom and Bree have already done a great job addressing two important misconceptions around 26.2. Tom discussed the idea that the revised guidance somehow weakens model risk regulation, and Bree addressed the misconception that SR 26.2 replaces SR 11.7. So I want to build on both of those discussions and focus on what I think is the practical supervisory implication institutions are now wrestling with. So specifically, if the guidance is not prescriptive and if it is described as most relevant to institutions above $30 billion in assets, what does that actually mean for supervisory expectations? Because I think there's this growing temptation in the industry to interpret flexibility as exemption. And I don't believe that that's what the agencies intended. What I think SR 26.2 actually does is move the industry towards more explicit, defensible, risk-based governance decisions. The agencies are effectively saying, Different institutions have different risk profiles, different models create different levels of exposure, and governance activities should scale accordingly. But institutions are still expected to identify, govern, monitor, and defend how they manage material model risk. In some ways, that may actually place greater emphasis on governance discipline because institutions now need to justify why their framework is appropriate. Let's see. Apologies. So let me start with the $30 billion threshold, and we're on the right slide with the $30 billion threshold, because I think that the language is sometimes being interpreted more categorically than the guidance intended.
Yep.
The guidance states this guidance is expected to be most relevant to banking organizations over $30 billion in total assets. That sentence has been quoted a lot. But the next sentence is equally important. The agencies continue by stating that, however, in some situations, this guidance also may be relevant to banking organizations with total assets of $30 billion or less that have significant exposure to model risk because of the prevalence and complexity of their models, or because of activities outside the scope of traditional community banking. That's exclusion language. That is not exclusion language. That's supervisory tailoring language. The agencies are recognizing that asset size alone is not an adequate measure of model risk. And frankly, many smaller and regional institutions today operate with meaningful quantitative complexity. Even below $30 billion, institutions may still rely heavily on CECL methodologies, BSA AML monitoring scenarios, vendor credit models, stress testing frameworks, interest rate risk models, and increasingly fraud analytics. Those activities can absolutely create material model risk. So I think the real supervisory message is this: governance expectations should be proportional to actual risk exposure. And that means smaller institutions may legitimately operate with leaner governance structures, more targeted validation activities, narrower inventories, and lighter monitoring approaches for lower risk items. And for many institutions, that flexibility is it's overdue. But flexibility is not the same thing as the absence of expectation. The institutions still need a defensible framework and still need to demonstrate that material risks are appropriately identified, governed, and monitored. And that brings me to what I think one of the most misunderstood aspects is of the revised guidance. And one area where I think confusion still exists is around the language that SR 26.2 is non-prescriptive and non-enforceable. The guidance states non-compliance with this guidance will not result in supervisory criticism against a banking organization, but the footnote immediately clarifies that supervisory action may still result from unsafe or unsound practices stemming from insufficient management of model risk. That distinction is critically important. The agencies are not saying model risk management no longer matters. What they're saying is that institutions have flexibility in how they implement governance, provided the framework remains effective and appropriate for the underlying risk. And that means examiners are likely to focus less on whether every institution follows identical procedural structures and more on whether governance decisions are intentional, risk-based, well-documented, and evidently effective. I actually think that increases the importance of governance rationale. Because if an institution chooses to reduce their validation frequency, classify items as immaterial, streamline their governance, or scale back on any certain activities, it now needs to explain clearly why those decisions remain appropriate. And if governance weaknesses later contribute to financial loss, poor reserve estimates, ineffective monitoring, compliance failures, or flawed business decisions, then the existence of the principles-based guidance will not shield the institution from criticism. In other words, the agencies may be reducing prescription, but they are not eliminating accountability. And I think that leads to the broader supervisory shift embedded in SR 26.2. Next slide. I think the deeper supervisory shift in SR 26.2 is the movement towards governance judgment. The revised guidance repeatedly emphasizes model materiality, inherent risk, model purpose, organizational complexity, and proportional governance. Those concepts require institutions to make more explicit risk decisions. At Mechanics Bank, one of the discussions that we've been having internally is how to better align governance activities to actual model exposure and business impact. That includes preserving stronger rigor for higher risk models while reducing low value duplication for lower risk activities. Strengthening our monitoring consistency and clarifying the governance boundaries between models, what we call quantitative tools or calculators, and AI use cases. I think many institutions are moving in a similar direction, and I think that is where 26.2 is likely to have the greatest practical impact, not by eliminating model risk management expectations, but by encouraging institutions to build governance frameworks that are more intentional, more risk-based, and more operationally sustainable. The challenge, however, is that institutions now must be able to defend those design choices very clearly. That means strong materiality frameworks, clear governance documentation, transparent escalation processes, effective monitoring, and well-supported rationale for tailoring decisions. So the supervisory discussions may increasingly become less about, did you follow the exact same process as everyone else, and more about, can you demonstrate that your governance design appropriately manages the risks your institution actually faces? And so my final takeaway would be this: I don't think that SR 26.2 should be interpreted as creating a world with fewer governance expectations. I think it should be interpreted as increasingly a world with more explicit governance accountability, especially around materiality, proportionality, governance rationale, and defensibility. Banks under $30 billion are not automatically exempt from meaningful model risk governance, and principles-based guidance does not eliminate supervisory consequence when governance weaknesses cause unsafe or unsound outcomes. The supervisory question has just simply evolved. The question has become, can institutions clearly explain why its governance framework is appropriate for its actual model risk exposures? And I think that will become one of the defining supervisory questions going forward. Thank you. Tom, Tyler, I'll pause and turn it back to you to see if we have any questions from the audience or on this topic or broader themes.
Hey, Jill, thank you for this. You were talking about the governance. It seems useful at a point in time that we want to be able to convey that our governance structures understand that this change is occurring, albeit relatively minor. Do you have any thoughts on key questions that the governance, the model risk management committees, or the executive risk committees, what are the questions that they should be posing to the model risk management groups to be able to show that they indeed understand that some of these conceptual changes are occurring? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think model governance committees should start asking more explicitly whether governance decisions are defensible under an institution's actual risk profile. So under 26.2, it's not enough to ask, did we complete the required validation or review? Committees should also ask, why is this the right level of governance for this model? For example, if the model's materiality is supported by its purpose, exposure, and its use. If we are classifying something as a material, what evidence supports that conclusion, and what scenario would cause us to revisit that classification? If we're reducing validation scope or the frequency, what risk factors justify that decision? And for models that are below the highest risk tiers, what monitoring or triggers remain in place so that it doesn't completely disappear from view? And I think newer committees discipline, the newer committee discipline is making sure that risk-based tailoring is not just efficient, but it's explainable and supported by evidence.
Right.
Thanks for
Perfect. Yeah, it seems to, a key question, at least in my mind, would be you had tier 1s, 2s, and 3s, and based on that, this is essentially how we made a determination of our higher or lower risk. So now that you're moving over to inherent model risk at an individual model level, or model materiality again at an individual level, how does that change it? Are they rank ordered essentially the same, so you'll get the same treatment, or now we're looking at it slightly different, such that the purpose now bumped it up because it's a regulatory output. For example, a particular model may now be used or has been used as regulatory in nature, and because this guidance actually calls us out of the purpose, if it's financial or if it's regulatory, it should get the highest level of materiality, and it's a slight change. It may not amount to a meaningful change to everyone, but to go through that exercise and to demonstrate that with the with your model risk committees seems to be a very useful exercise that we might want to prompt the committee to ask those questions of us to show that we indeed are taking this on. Okay, very good. Jill, thank you so much. Bree, thank you.